thought for my first video I would share a personal story about myself and my experiences with the unknown. When I was younger, I would always be plagued with nightmares. Mostly it was just the usual stuff like the boogeyman or monsters under my bed, but every now and then I would have a recurring dream where I would wake up and sitting at the foot of my bed would be two figures who took on the shape of Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street. The only differences were that their eyes were pitch black and their mouths were filled with razor-sharp teeth. Every time I had that dream, they would just sit there staring at me, smiling. Their stares would fill me with the kind of dread that I, still to this day, have never felt, nor would I like to feel again. Whenever I would try to move or run away, I couldn't. I was just stuck there, unable to even scream. Just when I thought I couldn't take much more, like my heart was about to burst through my chest, I would snap back into reality, a cold sweat running down my face and the two figures gone. It wasn't until much later on in life when I discovered that these incidents were more commonly known as sleep paralysis. Many people have talked about seeing a dark shadow man during their own personal sleep paralysis, and I always wondered why mine was different. Why did I see an evil Bert and Ernie? Was it just my childish brain, or was it something else entirely? When I was trying to figure it out, a memory rushed itself back into my mind. A memory I had successfully suppressed all this time. A memory I will share with you now. When I was about 9 years old, my sleep paralysis had already been happening for a few years. Every now and then Bert and Ernie would show up, and I would narrowly escape. When I brought it up to my parents, who were both police officers, they just chalked it up to letting me watch scary movies at a young age and told me to suck it up. Not wanting to seem weak, I did. Until one dreadful week. That entire week, the evil puppets visited me. Every night, they would do the same thing. Just stare at me with those dead black eyes and smile. Only this week, they wouldn't just stay at the foot of my bed. Every night, they'd be just a little closer to me. Still staring. Still smiling. When I would wake up in the morning, I would cry to my parents and ask if I could sleep with them. And of course, they said no. I was too old to be sleeping with them, they said. I pleaded with them until my dad threatened to spank me. The whole, "I'll give you something to be afraid of" speech. For any kid, that was the signal to stop. So I just went on as if nothing were happening. When I went to school that day, the only thing I could think about was not wanting to go home. Not wanting to fall asleep. Not wanting to see them again. That Saturday, both my parents were home at the same time for the first time in a while, and they decided to take the whole family out to the movies. I don't remember what movie it was. I just remember I had been running on fumes because for the last couple of nights, I tried to stay awake as long as I could. I was going to try and do the same thing that night, but the cool, dark movie theater was too cozy for me, and I passed out soon after the movie started. I woke up in my bed. I was thirsty, so I tried to get up to get some water. But I couldn't. That familiar feeling was like a dagger in my heart because I knew exactly what was happening. And what was coming next. Sure enough, Bert and Ernie appeared at the foot of my bed. But this time, they weren't sitting. They were standing straight up, staring at me with those eyes. My heart began to beat even faster than ever before. Just as I was about to scream out, they began to walk towards me. My eyes widened with terror as they inched closer and closer. Their movements were like that of a marionette puppet, and each step they took felt like an earthquake in my heart. Slowly, they reached the top of my bed where my frozen head laid. They stood there staring at me for what felt like forever. My eyes were glued to them. I couldn't even blink. Bert and Ernie then tilted their heads and smiled. Their teeth now up close looked like hundreds of giant bee stingers. Suddenly, they outstretched their arms and their mouths opened up. Past their hideous teeth was complete darkness, but in the distance of it I could faintly see flames. Even though it looked as though the flames were in the distance, I could feel the heat from them. It felt just like the heat that hits you when you open up an oven. My eyes dried up and caused me to blink. The puppets' mouths were mere inches from my face. The terror I felt to this day is still indescribable. The heat that came from their mouths intensified as they drew closer. The darkness within them was suddenly overcome with fire. The heat caused my eyes to dry up again, and once again made me blink. Just then I realized. I blinked. If I can blink, maybe I can move. Their teeth were now just centimeters from my face. I pushed up with all the strength I had, and somehow just before they reached me, I snapped up. I popped up with such force that it launched me out of my bed. I landed on my stomach. I jumped right back onto my feet and ran straight for my parents' room. I rushed through their open door and immediately felt safe. I always felt safe there. I remember my dad telling me he'd spank me if I slept in their bed. But my clever 9-year-old mind thought, well, he didn't say anything about the floor. I grabbed a spare blanket from their closet and laid down on the floor by my father's side of the bed. As I laid my head down to finally rest, I looked out of the open door, and what I saw still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. Just outside my parents' door, I saw them. Bert and Ernie. This time, I wasn't asleep. I was wide awake. They both looked at me. Their eyes were filled with anger and hatred. I was waiting for them to start moving towards me again, but they just stood there. Our eyes never turned away from each other when suddenly, they pointed up. I cautiously broke eye contact to look at what they were pointing at, and at the top of my parents' doorway, there hung the cross my grandma gave to my father. It's been in our family for generations. It took a second, but I finally realized that they couldn't pass into my parents' room because of it. I took some comfort in knowing that, but they were still out there, tormenting me. I thought about closing the door, but I didn't want to risk getting too close to them. They remained outside of my parents' room glaring at me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I pulled the blanket over my head so I couldn't see them anymore, but I could still feel their presence. I could still feel their hatred. I could still feel the fire. Before I knew it, it was morning. I couldn't sleep a wink knowing that they were out there. When my father woke up and found me on the ground with the covers over my head, he asked me what the hell I was doing down there. I told him everything, the puppets, the teeth, the fire, but it wasn't until I mentioned the cross that he seemed to take me seriously. He sat me on his leg and he asked me to tell him everything again. As I told him my story for the second time, I saw something in his eyes that seemed familiar to me, but I still haven't been able to put my finger on what it was. Later that week, we had a priest come by and bless the house. And not long after that, we got a dog, and she would sleep with me every night. Maybe it was because I felt safer with my dog sleeping with me, or maybe it was because of the blessing, but since then, I never saw Bert and Ernie again.